Judith Basin, Montana, October 1876. The air was sharp with the coming frost, and the cottonwoods along the creek had surrendered their last yellow leaves. In the clearings between the hills, cabins were being chinked, woodpiles were growing into small mountains, and the grim arithmetic of winter survival was on every man's mind. On Halvard Nesse's claim, however, something different was happening, something foolish. He was building his cabin for the second time. The first, a standard log structure he'd thrown up the previous year, still stood as the outer shell, but inside he had framed a second, thinner wall of planks, leaving a gap between the two. The space was immense, a full 18 inches, and into this cavity, Halvard Nesse, a quiet Norwegian with ice-blue eyes, was stuffing raw, greasy sheep's wool. Not clean, carded wool. This was the refuse from shearing, clotted with lanolin, dirt, and bits of prairie grass. Colfax Burridge, the sheep broker who controlled the wool trade in the basin, reined in his horse, his face a mask of disbelief. Burridge was a man who understood wool as a commodity, its grade, its weight, its price. To see it used as wall stuffing was like watching a man insulate his house with dollar bills. He dismounted, walking over to where Nesse was tamping down another armful with a long pole. A few other settlers, Jedediah Sykes and Amos Pritchard among them, had already gathered to watch the spectacle. "Nesse," Burridge said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who rarely had to raise it. "What in God's name are you doing?" Halvard paused, looking up. "Building." Burridge gestured with a leather-gloved hand at the greasy fleece. "With that wool will rot wet and breed lice. By the time the spring thaw comes, you'll have a cabin full of mold and vermin and a smell that'll turn a buzzard's stomach. It's madness." Amos Pritchard, a carpenter who had served with the Union Army and prided himself on square corners and tight dovetails, nodded in agreement. "There's no structure in that, Halvard. The inner wall bears no load. It's wasted lumber and wasted time." Halvard Nesse simply picked up another bundle of fleece. "The wool must be greasy," he said, more to himself than to them, and returned to his work. The men watched for another minute, then shook their heads and drifted away, leaving the mad Norwegian to his foolish task. The mockery had begun. What did this Norwegian cedar carpenter, a man from the high, damp pastures of Hardanger, understand about conductive resistance that a seasoned sheep broker and the most experienced builders in the basin had missed? The answer to that question would not be found in argument, but in the brutal, clarifying physics of a Montana winter. Before we see how this wall of wool performed in that unforgiving crucible, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We explore the lost wisdom of those who survived on the edge, and I promise you we'll learn the precise science of why still, trapped air is the most powerful insulator on the planet. Have you ever seen an old building with an unusual insulation method? Tell us about it in the comments below. Halvard Nesse was not a plainsman. He was not a hunter or a trapper or a cavalry scout. He had never learned the subtle language of a prairie landscape. He was a cedar carpenter, a builder of the small, sturdy summer cabins nestled in the high mountain pastures of western Norway. His hands knew the heft of a broad axe on pine, the feel of fitting stave logs, the particular scent of a mountain meadow after a rain. He had spent his life working with the materials of his world, river stone for foundations, thick timbers for walls, and for the gaps, for the relentless damp cold that seeped from the mountainsides, he used what was at hand: moss and the raw, lanolin-rich wool of the old Norse sheep. He was a man whose knowledge was carved not into books, but into the very grain of the wood he worked. He had come to Montana with his wife, Ingrid, and their two small children, Lars and Solveig, chasing the promise of land. They arrived in time to build a simple cabin before the winter of 1875 descended. It was a textbook frontier cabin, with 10-inch logs and careful chinking, and it had nearly killed them. That first winter became a collection of sharp, painful memories. Halvard remembered the way the iron door hinges would shriek when touched, the cold so deep it changed the very nature of the metal. He remembered the salt in its wooden cellar on the shelf, meant to be loose and granular, caking into a solid block of crystal he had to chip apart with a knife. Most unsettling was the silence of the cold. On the bitterest nights, the flame of their single candle would stand perfectly still, not flickering or dancing in a draft, but burning with an unnerving, rigid calm. There was no draft because the cabin was sealed tight. The stillness meant the entire volume of air inside the room, from floor to ceiling, had surrendered to the cold. It was a perfect, uniform, and lethal 30 degrees below freezing. They survived by huddling together under every blanket they owned, feeding the small stove a constant diet of precious wood, waking up shivering in a room that felt as cold as the outdoors. That winter, Halvard didn't just feel the cold. He studied it. He watched it, listened to it, and understood he was fighting the wrong war. The fundamental failure of the conventional cabins in the Judith Basin was a problem of physics, a failure everyone experienced but few truly understood. The enemy wasn't the cold air rushing in through cracks. A man could solve that with mud and moss. The true enemy was conduction, the silent, relentless flow of heat right through the solid wood of the walls. Heat is simply the vibration of molecules. In a dense, solid material like a pine log, those vibrations are passed from one molecule to the next with brutal efficiency. The warmth inside the cabin, generated at great expense by the wood stove, vibrated the molecules on the inner surface of the logs. Those molecules jostled their neighbors, who jostled theirs, and in a silent, unstoppable chain reaction, that precious energy would travel the 10 inches of wood and escape into the vast, cold emptiness of the Montana night. A 10-inch pine log, no matter how well fitted, has a thermal resistance, an R value, of about R8. It was barely better than a solid wall of stone. Men like Amos Pritchard built with incredible skill, their dovetail notches so tight a knife blade couldn't find a gap. But the heat didn't care about the gaps. It bypassed them, marching straight through the timber itself. The result was an interior wall surface that was always cold to the touch, constantly pulling warmth from the air and from the bodies of the people inside. The consequence was a life dictated by the stove. Families lived in a small bubble of warmth within a larger box of cold. To sit 10 feet from the fire was to feel a draft on your back, not from a leak, but from your own body heat being sucked away by the frigid walls. The battle was constant and exhausting. It meant rising in the blackness of a 4 a.m. darkness to rekindle a dead fire in a room filled with frozen breath. It meant burning through 4, 5, even 6 cords of wood in a single winter, a monumental labor of felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking that consumed the entire autumn. The conventional cabin wasn't a shelter, it was a sieve. Halvard Nesse, having survived one winter in that sieve, had sworn he would not endure another. His work through that autumn of 1876 became a local curiosity. He began by felling and peeling enough lodgepole pines to frame the inner wall. He fastened them to the interior of his existing cabin, creating the 18-inch void. Then came the planks, rough-sawn boards he'd traded for, which he began nailing to the inside of the new frame, working his way up from the floor. As he completed each course of 3 feet, he would stop and begin the strange ritual of insulation. The wool came from Colfax Burridge, though not by a direct sale. It was the tags, the cast-off belly and leg wool, too dirty and matted to be baled and sold. Burridge had let him haul it away for next to nothing, assuming he was going to use it to bank the outside of his foundation, a common if smelly practice. When he saw it going inside the walls, his commercial sensibilities were offended. Halvard worked with a methodical rhythm. He would take a great armful of the greasy fleece and push it into the cavity. Then he would take a long, debarked pole and tamp it down, not so tight as to be a solid mass, but firmly enough to ensure there were no empty pockets. He packed it to a density he knew by feel, a skill learned in the high cedar of Norway. The smell was earthy and strong, the scent of lanolin, sweat, and sheep. His wife Ingrid watched from the doorway, her expression a mixture of profound trust and practical concern. "It smells like the high pastures, Halvard," she said one afternoon, wrinkling her nose slightly. "But will it keep the damp out? Old Guri's cabin in the valley always smelled of mildew." "The grease, Ingrid," he answered, not looking up from his work. "The lanolin, it sheds the water. The air is the wall. The wool just holds it still." The skeptics continued their visits. Amos Pritchard pointed out that the double wall had cost Nesse $12 in lumber from the mill in Lewistown, a significant sum. "You could have bought another stove for that, Halvard, and been twice as warm." Jedediah Sykes, a freighter who had seen his share of strange things on the frontier, simply laughed. "Come spring, Nesse, you'll be tearing it all out. The mice will think you built them a palace." Through it all, Halvard remained placid. He listened to their criticisms, nodded politely, and continued his work. He was not building for them. He was building for the memory of a still candle flame. He was building for his children, so they might play on the floor in January. He was building a wall not of wood, but of air. The mockery lasted for 6 weeks. The validation would last for a century. The central problem inside a conventional cabin wasn't the cold getting in. The problem was the heat getting out. Halvard Nesse understood this on an intuitive level, but the science behind his strange wall of wool is a masterclass in thermodynamics. Heat moves in 3 ways: convection, radiation, and conduction. A well-chinked cabin largely stops convection, the movement of heat through air currents. Radiation is the heat you feel from a glowing stove, which travels as electromagnetic waves. But conduction, the movement of heat through a solid material, was the great unconquered enemy. To defeat conduction, you need to create a break in the path that heat travels. You need a material that resists the transfer of molecular energy, and there is no material more resistant and more readily available than air. Air is a superb insulator, but only if it is held perfectly still. If the air in a wall cavity can move, it will. Warm air will rise, cool against the cold outer wall, and sink, creating a convection loop that actively carries heat from the inner wall to the outer wall, making the situation even worse. This is where the genius of the wool lay. The structure of a single wool fiber is complex. It is crimped and scaled, designed by nature to trap air. Millions upon millions of these fibers, packed together, create an incredibly intricate maze of tiny air pockets. The air in these pockets is trapped. It cannot move. It cannot form convection loops. It becomes a static, 18-inch thick barrier of stillness. But why the greasy, raw wool? Why not clean fleece? This addressed Colfax Burridge's most potent objection: moisture and rot. Winter air inside a cabin, warmed by a stove and filled with the moisture of breathing and cooking, is far more humid than the cold, dry air outside. This water vapor is driven to move from the area of high concentration inside to low outside. When this moist air hits a cold surface, like the inside of a log wall, it condenses, turning into liquid water or frost. This is what caused the ice on the inside of his neighbor's walls. This moisture would soak conventional insulation like cotton or grass, causing it to slump, rot, and lose all its insulating properties. Lanolin, the natural grease in raw wool, is hydrophobic. It actively repels water. As the warm, moist air from inside the cabin migrated through the wool, the lanolin coating on the fibers prevented it from condensing. The water vapor passed through the wall as a vapor and only condensed or froze when it hit the truly cold outer log shell, far from the warm interior. The wool stayed dry. It could not rot. And because it was dry and filled with inedible lanolin, it was a terrible home for vermin and lice, which require moisture and a different kind of organic material to thrive. The numbers tell the final story. As we noted, a 10-inch log wall offers an R value of about R8. 18 inches of densely packed wool insulation offers an R value of over R60. It wasn't just a marginal improvement. Halvard Nesse hadn't built a better wall. He had built a different technology entirely. He had built a thermal fortress. That winter, the weather decided to test every aspect of Nesse's design. It began with a Chinook. For 3 days in early January, a warm, dry wind blew down from the mountains. The temperature in the Judith Basin soared to an unbelievable 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow melted into slush, the ground thawed into mud, and a deceptive feeling of spring filled the air. Water was everywhere. It was the perfect breeding ground for the rot and mold Colfax Burridge had predicted. If there was ever a time for moisture to penetrate Nesse's walls and begin its destructive work, this was it. Then, on the 4th day, the Chinook collapsed. The wind died, the sky cleared to a pale, hard, merciless blue, and the temperature fell off a cliff. By nightfall, it was 10 below zero. By midnight, it was 20 below. For 9 consecutive nights, the temperature in the windless basin bottomed out at minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a pure, still, radiative cold, the kind that leaches heat from any object with terrifying speed. Inside the cabin of Amos Pritchard, the skilled carpenter, misery reigned. His family slept in their coats and hats, huddled together. The 2 cords of wood he thought would last until February were half gone already. The windows were opaque, covered in a thick, fern-like lacework of ice on the inside. Every nail-head in the walls was white with its own tiny circle of frost, a perfect map of the thermal bridges conducting cold straight through the timber. At the general store, Silas Crane was burning through his woodpile at a rate that frightened him. Despite having the best-built structure in the settlement, the cold was winning. His wife had moved their bed into the main room, as close to the big potbelly stove as possible. The back rooms were abandoned, colder than a winter tomb. Inside the Nesse cabin, life proceeded with a strange, quiet normalcy. The small stove glowed with a low, steady fire, consuming wood at a placid pace. Halvard had calculated he was using less than 1/3 of the wood his neighbors burned. There was no ice on his windows. Not a speck of frost on the inner walls. The air was warm, but not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that was the same in the corners as it was by the fire. Ingrid sat near the lamp, mending one of Lars's shirts, her fingers nimble and sure. The children, Lars and Solveig, were on the wooden floor, playing with a set of small, carved animals. Their coats and hats hung on pegs by the door. The proof of the cabin's impossible performance sat on the small table, 10 feet from the stove. It was a small pat of butter in a clay dish. In any other cabin in the Judith Basin, it would have been a frozen rock, impossible to spread. Here, in the gentle, even warmth of Halvard's wool-lined home, the butter was soft. The vindication came at dawn on the 5th day of the cold snap. Colfax Burridge was in the saddle, his face wrapped in a wool scarf until only his eyes were visible. The cold was a physical presence, so intense it felt like it had weight. He was riding a grim circuit, tallying his losses. The extreme cold was brutal on livestock. He had already found a dozen ewes frozen solid in the coulees where they had sought shelter from a wind that never came. As the sun cleared the horizon, its light catching the ice crystals hanging in the air, he looked across the basin. What he saw made him pull his horse to a halt. Every structure, from the humblest sod-roof dugout to Silas Crane's proud two-story store, was encased in a thick white shell. A layer of rime, 2 inches thick, coated every roof and every wall. Burridge, a man of the plains, knew exactly what he was seeing. It was the frozen breath of the buildings themselves. It was the physical evidence of escaping heat and moisture, hitting the frigid air and condensing into a massive cocoon of frost. It was a monument to waste, a glittering tombstone for lost BT-us. Then his eyes found Halvard Nesse's claim on the gentle slope across the creek. He squinted, thinking the light was playing tricks on him. It wasn't. Against the brilliant white of the snow-covered ground, Nesse's cabin stood stark and dark. The planks of his outer walls were bare. The roof had snow on it, but the walls were clean, dark wood. The frost line, that universal signature of a warm object in a cold world, stopped dead at the surface of the logs. There was no heat escaping to feed the rime. Burridge sat on his horse for a long time, the cold forgotten. He was a practical man, a man who dealt in the tangible realities of weight and fleece and dollars. What he was looking at was impossible, yet undeniably real. He nudged his horse forward, his mind replaying his confident pronouncements of rot and vermin. He rode not to the front of the cabin, but around to the side, as if reluctant to confront the owner. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the crystalline snow. Halvard emerged from the door, carrying a wooden bucket, on his way to the creek. He saw Burridge and stopped, his face calm, showing no surprise, no hint of triumph. Burridge gestured at the bare walls, his own breath pluming white. "There's no frost on your walls, Nesse." It was not a question. It was a statement of surrender. "No," Halvard said simply. "The heat stays inside." He paused. "Come in. It is cold." Burridge hesitated, then stamped the snow from his boots and followed him. He braced himself for the expected blast of overpowering heat near the stove, the pocket of warmth surrounded by an aura of cold. But it wasn't there. As he stepped inside, the feeling was not of heat, but of the complete absence of cold. The warmth was gentle even, wrapping around him like a blanket. He slowly unbuttoned his heavy coat. Halvard pointed to the inner wall, a few feet from the door. Pressed against the smooth plank was a strip of rawhide lacing. "I put this there last night," he said. "Feel it." Burridge pulled off his thick glove. He knew what rawhide felt like at 30 below. It became as hard and brittle as glass. The lashings on his own saddle were like iron rods. He reached out his bare hand and pressed his palm against the piece on the wall. He expected a shock of cold, a stiffness that would hurt his fingers. Instead, the leather was soft. It was pliable. It yielded to the pressure of his thumb. It was almost warm to the touch. The proof was absolute, a sensory shock that dismantled his entire understanding of how a building should work. He stood there, his hand on the wall, feeling the impossible softness of the hide. He looked from the wall to the quiet Norwegian. He saw the children playing on the floor, their cheeks rosy, not from feverish heat, but from simple health. He saw Ingrid humming softly as she kneaded dough on the table. He finally understood. Halvard hadn't been stuffing his walls with trash. He had been filling them with stillness. Burridge finally dropped his hand and shook his head, a slow look of awe spreading across his face. "My God, Nesse," he said, his voice low. "You didn't build a cabin. You built a winter pasture." Word of the frost-free cabin traveled the way all important news did on the frontier, slowly at first, then all at once. It wasn't a newspaper story, but a series of conversations, of men repeating what Colfax Burridge had seen. But seeing is believing. And the real catalyst for the spread of Halvard's idea came with the spring thaw and the shearing season. Because of his own growing flock, Nesse's claim was a natural gathering point for one of the itinerant shearing crews that moved through the basin. For a week, his property was filled with the clamor of men and sheep. As they worked, sweating under the May sun, they would look over at the strange, thick-walled cabin that had become a local legend. During their breaks, they would wander over, and Halvard, a man of few words, would simply show them. He had left a small, removable panel on one section of the inner wall. He would unlatch it and pull it away, revealing the cross-section, the outer log, the inner plank, and the 18 inches of dense, springy, lanolin-rich wool packed between them. He let them touch it, smell it. They saw for themselves there was no mold, no nest of mice, no rot. It was just dry, greasy wool. Among the ranchers waiting for their flocks to be shorn were 3 pragmatic men who had lost significant numbers of livestock in the January cold snap: Jacob Miller, Thomas Vance, and Henry Odell. They had listened to the stories, but seeing the evidence with their own eyes was different. They asked Halvard about the cost, $12 for the lumber. They asked him about the labor, 6 weeks of his own time. Then they did their own calculations: the cost of lost ewes, the value of the cords of wood they wouldn't have to cut, the simple, incalculable value of a winter spent in warmth rather than misery. Before the shearing crew had packed up and moved on, all 3 men had resolved to build their own wool walls before the next snow flew. The idea was spreading, not from a blueprint or a book, but from hand to hand, from one man's undeniable success to another's practical need. Halvard Nesse had no formal training in physics or engineering. He was simply a practitioner of a craft honed over centuries in a different landscape. Yet his simple, elegant solution prefigured some of the most advanced concepts of modern building science by 100 years. His double-plank wall, with its thick cavity, is the direct ancestor of the double-stud walls used in today's high-performance construction. His choice of a dense-packed, loose-fill insulation, the wool, is the forerunner of modern cellulose or fiberglass insulation. Most importantly, his understanding that the insulation had to be thick and continuous, with no logs or studs bridging the gap to conduct heat, is the fundamental principle behind a thermal break, a cornerstone of energy-efficient design. Without ever hearing the terms, Halvard Nesse had built a super-insulated wall assembly. He had created a structure that didn't just shelter from the weather, but actively managed the flow of energy through its envelope, a century before the concept would be given a name. The true genius of Halvard Nesse's design was not in its power, but in its profound patience. The other cabins in the Judith Basin waged a constant, violent war against the cold. They burned fuel furiously, generating immense heat in a desperate battle of addition, trying to pour warmth into a leaking vessel faster than it could escape. It was a strategy of brute force, and it was exhausting and inefficient. Nesse's cabin did something entirely different. It refused to fight. It practiced a quiet, deep conservation. It accepted the small, steady heat from a modest fire, the warmth from the bodies of his family, the energy from the lamp, and it simply held it. It wrapped that precious, life-sustaining warmth in a thick, still blanket and prevented its escape. The structure didn't try to defeat the infinite cold of the Montana night. It simply outlasted it. Halvard Nesse didn't add more heat. He slowed its leaving until the cold ran out of night. In a place that valued strength and force, his greatest contribution was a lesson in the power of quiet resistance. The frontier didn't reward credentials or theories. It rewarded what worked. And what worked was not a bigger fire, but a slower leak. If you found this story of quiet ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explorations into the practical genius of the past. What other natural or unconventional materials have been used for insulation throughout history? Share your knowledge and stories in the comments below. We read every one. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, based on historically inspired reconstructions. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar methods in modern construction should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.